All right, good afternoon, everyone. For the few of you who don't know me, I'm Pavlos Protobabas. I'm the Scientific Program Director for the Institute for Applied Computational Science. You're here for the seminar, for our seminar series. Just one announcement before I introduce our speaker. The next talk will be March 25th. We're taking a break during the spring break and before. Rajit Ghani from the University of Chicago will be talking about practical data science for social impact. Today is my pleasure to introduce Megan Price. Megan Price is Executive Director for the Human Rights Data Analysis Group at HR TAC, also known. Megan got her bachelor's at Case Western University and master's in statistics. She followed that while she was doing her master's and bachelor, she was part of a consulting group at Case Western, and she found that her interest is more about humanities, human rights, so she started getting interested in that. But she also knew that she's academic in the essence, so she did follow that with a PhD at Emory at Atlanta, a PhD in biostatistics. But while she was doing her PhD, she was taking courses in human rights and related topics. After that, she followed that by joining the HR TAC, which is where she's there now. She's the Executive Director of the Data Analysis Group. And she's one of the 3 full-time scientists. For students that are interested in doing data science that a little bit more meaningful, Megan will be here until Tuesday or Monday. Please come and talk to her afterwards. So the group is doing very interesting things, very important aspects. What they usually do is analyze conflicts using rigorous data science. That's one of the 2 approaches they take. Well, the other one is to looking at paper archives, digitize them, and trying to make sense of past conflicts. She's also a fellow at the Carnegie Mellon University, and she's the human rights editor for a journal that is long, Statistical Journal of International Association for Official Statistics, also known as IACS. So that's majesty. So today, Megan will present how machine learning helps count casualties in Syria. So help me welcome her.
Well, thank you. Thank you for that very nice introduction. We refer to our organization as HR DAG, and I will, I might be able to use this. Okay, do you want to play with it? No. Yeah, I'm going to dance back and forth. So I'll start today by providing a little bit of introduction and background to our organization, the work that we do, the projects we take on. I'll delve a little bit into what I mean when I say data, what data for our projects look like, and then I'll get into the meat of the talk, which is this particular application of record linkage to counting casualties in Syria. I'm only going to get into the details of 2 specific steps within that process, what we call blocking and pairwise classification, just so that I can calibrate to the room who already has some sense of what those words mean, maybe does some work with record linkage, has some experience with. Okay. And then if we have time, which I think we should, I'll get to what I'm calling bonus MSE, and I'll tell you what that is when we get to it, and if we do run out of time, maybe you can ask me about it during the Q&A. So the Human Rights Data Analysis Group is an interdisciplinary team of scientists that helps human rights advocates to make better use of data. And all of our work is grounded in this quote from HRDAG's co-founder, Dr. Patrick Ball. And I always like to start with it because we get into a lot of technical details and we really fret and worry a lot about our methodological applications and the assumptions of those applications and whether they're working right and what they mean. But we always want to come back to remembering that the reason we're doing this is because we have a moral obligation to do the best work that's technically possible so that the victim's story is heard and believed. And to fail to do so disrespects the suffering of that victim. And so always at the end of the day, we're coming back to, have we amplified the voices of this community? Have we contributed in some small way to accountability, to justice? And those are the kinds of projects that we take on. We've worked in, as Pavlos mentioned, a variety of countries. Most of the places that you can think of where something terrible happened, we've worked. We partner with a variety of organizations, from the United Nations to Human Rights Watch to local non-governmental organizations in countries in conflict or post-conflict, to local prosecutors. Really depends on the project. But most of our projects start with some data and a question. And typically, the question is, how many people have been killed? And this seems like a fairly straightforward question. It's certainly the fundamental starting point when you're thinking about a conflict. What happened? How many people were killed? From a human rights perspective and from some of the more complicated transitional justice topics, this is actually one of the most straightforward questions you can ask, because there's general agreement upon whether or not a death has occurred, and it can only happen to an individual once. So compared to some other more complicated human rights violations, death is a pretty easy one to study. And yet, even in the best of circumstances, this question is very difficult to answer. And the reason in our case is because, almost by definition, some portion of violence, and particularly conflict violence, is hidden. Some portion of the violence we're not going to be able to know about, certainly not right away. And unlike a lot of other situations where we might have the luxury of a well-designed probabilistic sample or a survey out in the field, in most of our projects, what we have access to are convenient samples. We have access to data that were collected with good intentions, with very careful, systematic, well-designed data collection processes, but they're snapshots. They're information that the groups or the individuals had access to at the time. And so instead, in most of our projects, what we find ourselves starting with is this question: how many uniquely identified victims were reported to at least one source? Initially, this seems like a slightly less interesting question. And certainly, once you start to unpack all of the qualifiers in that question, it should be pretty obvious that that's going to be a subset of the total number of victims who were killed. There are always going to be victims whose names we don't know, whose stories have not yet been told. But with the data that we have access to, this is a place that we can start. And in fact, this is the question that we answered in our collaboration with the United Nations Office of the High Commissioner for Human Rights in a series of reports that we described as an enumeration. It was an examination of what was known to a series of documentation groups. And this is where we get into a record linkage problem. Because when we have multiple lists of named victims, we need to ask, well, how many of those victims are named in multiple places? Maybe they're named multiple times in the same list because their family member reported them, and then also somebody else in their community posted information about their death on Facebook, and then somebody else reported it through their religious leader in town. But also maybe multiple sources documented that victim. So this brings us to record linkage. And at HRDAG, we think of this record linkage problem in this framework, which I'm mostly showing to highlight that it is fairly complicated and many steps are involved. And today, I'm really only going to have time to unpack 2 of those steps. In the most general terms, what we do is supervised record linkage. And I actually think of it as heavily supervised. There's a lot of iterating that happens in this framework, moving between what the computer models are telling us and what our human data reviewers are telling us. And in these situations, we assume that our human review of the data is giving us the right answer. And I'll get into that more as we move into the steps. I also want to mention the reason we think about the process this way and with this framework is because we need our analytical methods to be scalable, to be transparent, to be auditable, and to be replicable. And so that's why we try and visualize what all the steps are, and it's why we have a bias toward free and open source software, so that we can invite other researchers to challenge our work and to replicate our work and see if they come to the same conclusions. And indeed, we are far from the first people to have this kind of problem. Record linkage questions come up in a wide variety of fields. This is a very incomplete list of references. It's more like the highlights of the various publications and authors that have most heavily influenced our work and our approach. And our approach has really evolved over the last 10 or 15 years. During the early 2000s, we relied pretty heavily on software written by Weka, and we glued it together with bits of Python and Java and shell script. Now there are more and more off-the-shelf modules available in Python, so we rely almost exclusively now on Python to do the record linkage and the classification models. We still tend to favor R for summary statistics, diagnostics, graphs. But again, we have this bias toward free and open source software, not only because they do such a good job of playing together nicely, but they also play with LaTeX very well. So when we go to write our reports, everything seamlessly integrates. And we believe it keeps the door open in the maximum way for whatever the next tool to come down the pipeline is, so that we can always reach for the best tool to solve our problems. So when I talk about Syria, what am I actually talking about? What do these records look like? What do the data look like? What's actually going on? So in Syria, in all of the examples and results that I talk about today, I'm going to be talking about 4 sources. But I put an asterisk on that because over the last 4 years that we've been working on this project and through our collaboration with the UN, the number of sources has increased and decreased. And which those specific sources are has changed. And if you read any of the reports that we wrote with the UN, there's a long appendix describing all of these organizations and the different periods of the conflict that they cover and that they have access to. For simplicity's sake, today, I'm only going to think about 4. And they are the 4 that are actively collaborating with us right now and whose records cover the entire period of the conflict. Today, I'm only going to consider the period from the beginning of the conflict in 2011 through the end of April in 2015. We're working on updating our records all the way through 2015, but for right now, we only have them through April. Now, what that means is we're starting with about 360,000 named individual records. Now that gets 2 asterisks, and I should underline it and italicize it and jump up and down and be absolutely clear that in no way implies that that's the number of victims in this conflict. What that means is that's the number of names that have been written down by at least one, and in most cases, multiple of these 4 sources. So there are a lot of records within that number that refer to the same individual. And that's the first question we have to ask, is how can we identify multiple records that refer to the same individual? And one way to think about that, first I should tell you what those records look like. So this is a screen grab from one of our sources, the Violation Documentation Center. And they make this list publicly available. This is a public-facing website. That's part of their advocacy efforts. They feel it's very important to make this information as widely available as possible to tell as many stories as they can. And this is the English translated version of their website. Should you be interested in investigating this on your own, I strongly recommend using the Arabic list. They update that with much more regularity than the English list. But we just scrape this public list. That's how we get our information. Although we have a relationship with VDC for a variety of reasons, it's difficult for them to share data directly with us. And so we scrape their publicly available Arabic list of named victims. And essentially, that's the data that we have. We have the name of the victim, and at minimum, the date and location of their death. Now, each of the documentation groups do their best to record other demographic information. In most cases, we know the sex of the victim. They try to record age, but that's actually missing in almost 80% of cases. Sometimes we have information about their occupation, or we might have finer grained geographic information. We start with the governorate or the province within Syria where they were killed, but in some cases we have more specific location information. Sometimes we have information about their affiliation or their combat status, but that is a whole nother can of worms and a whole nother presentation about how difficult it is to make that distinction and to determine how that distinction is being made. This is what our records look like. And one of the ways we start these projects, and do I have any Arabic readers in the audience? Okay, because whenever I show this to Arabic speakers, they always kind of tilt their head because English is read left to right and Arabic is read right to left. And so when I mix the two languages, one of them has to end up backwards. And I'm an English speaker, so the Arabic's backwards. So it looks very funny. But this is the way that we start thinking about how do we know if multiple records refer to the same individual? Well, I could think of all the pairs of my records, and I could ask, does this pair refer to the same person? And this is how we generate our labeled data or our training data, is we send this to a series of reviewers, a number of individuals, some of whom review the data in the native Arabic, some of whom review the data in poorly translated English versions, and they say, yes, this pair refers to the same individual, no, this pair does not, or question mark, I can't tell. It's too hard, there's not enough information, the names are kind of similar, I'm not sure. But this is where we start. And if you think about starting with 360,000 records, that's way too many every possible pair. That becomes computationally intractable almost immediately. And so one of the first challenges that we face is, how can we do data reduction? How can we make some rules so that we don't have to consider every possible pair? And there are some fairly obvious ways that we can go about doing this. And again, there's a lot of different methods out there. I should mention briefly that a lot of what I'm going to say about blocking, which is this first step in data reduction, my business partner, Patrick Ball, wrote up in a 5-part series all about blocking. It is aptly named A Geeky Deep Dive. It's a series of IPython notebooks. It's a bunch of example code in Python for those of you who really want to dig into the details of how this works. Patrick also lays out some of the alternative methods that we considered and ended up not using. For the sake of time, I'm just going to talk about what we did, in fact, end up doing, which is following essentially an algorithm laid out by Michelson and Knobloch in 2006. This is one of the lessons that we keep learning. I feel like we learn it about every 6 months, that we should stop reinventing the wheel, that whenever we get stuck, we should always go back to the literature and go implement what lots of other people have already been thinking about and the solutions that lots of other people have come up with. So this is one of the things that we struggle with as a small team, and one of the things that I always put out when I have the opportunity to talk to people at universities is, if you're interested in these problems and you're interested in this work and you see a paper that seems like it might be useful, please send it to me because it's very difficult for us to stay on top of all the developments and all of the different fields that we end up working in. But what we ended up implementing is a blocking approach implemented by Michelson and Knobloch. And again, a theme that I'm going to come back to again and again is, how do you know if you've done a good job? How do you know if you've successfully reduced the dimensions of your data without totally screwing something else up? And the answer in this case is you want to consider 2 different numbers. You want to consider the reduction rate. So how much have your blocked pairs, BP, reduced the proportion of the total pairs that you were initially considering? But at the same time, are you covering as many of the positive pairs as your human matcher has identified for you? Do you have pairs completeness? Because if I wanted to be lazy, I could make up a blocking rule that I just wouldn't consider any pairs at all. I'd have really good reduction ratio. I would have reduced it to 0 pairs. But I would also have 0 pairs coverage. So I need to balance these 2 metrics in the way that I think about making a set of rules. And we make those rules using something called a disjunction of conjunctions, which is really just a fancy way of saying we combine a bunch of columns and then make blocks out of them. And I'll give a more specific example in just a second. But what we ended up with were 20 conjunctions, 20 different rules. And we have nearly complete pairs coverage, which is great. The other thing that's really nice about this, and what I mean when I say very heavily supervised, is that this is one of the first places that we're going to go back to our human matcher. We're going to go grab those 0.04% of the positive pairs that our blocking rules missed, and we're going to ask her to look at them again. We're going to ask her, are you sure they're matches? Is there something weird about them? Can you help us make up a blocking rule so that we cover them as well? And we get that kind of coverage with slightly under 50 million pairs. And 50 with an M is significantly better than 65 billion with a B. And it's also a lot better than even the approach we were using late last year, where we were generating about 365 million pairs, which was still vaguely workable, but meant that I spent a lot of time farming things out to an Amazon instance. In a lot of cases with slightly under 50 million pairs, we can run a lot of the steps just locally on our laptops. There's still some steps we have to farm out, but this is a much more tractable number for us. So what do I mean a disjunction of conjunctions? What it means is that I take all of the information available to me in those few little columns in each record, the victim's name, the date and location of their death, and I think of other ways to describe that information. What about the metaphone of their name, the phonetic sound that their name makes? What about the edit distance between names? What if I take all the name tokens and I sort them alphabetically so that I am no longer sensitive to whether this group recorded first name, last name, father's name, and this group recorded first name, father's name, last name? What if I only consider the first few characters? What if I consider geographic distance? And on and on and on. And so our conjunction rules essentially just combine those ideas. And so we ended up choosing 20. I'm just showing about 7 here. But if you imagine the very first line, what that says is take all the records in which the metaphone, the phonetic sound of the first name, match, and in which the metaphone of the last name match, and in which the year of their reported death match. So take that subset of records, divide them up into those groups, and then within each of those groups, consider every possible pair. Or, and then we get to the next line, consider records that, and we just go through each one of these sets of rules, and that's how we subset our data. And we only consider the set of pairs that falls into at least one of these rules. And this is just the data setup. We had to do all this thinking and pondering just to do the very first step in our big complicated diagram, just so that we could get ourselves down to 50 million pairs that we could then actually do the rest of the stuff on, that we could then consider, that we could then start to work our way toward. What question were we asking again? So there's a lot more detail about that in the Geeky Deep Dive. One of the really cool things that Patrick figured out for folks who are into this is a way to use indexing to do all of that accounting of how many pairs each rule produces without actually having to produce the pairs. So we do a lot of really nice kind of Python counting. And then when we move into the next step, which is compare, which I'm mostly going to hand wave my way over, that's when we actually generate the 50 million pairs. Because what we do in the compare step is we need a way to summarize numerically the similarity between each of those pairs. Because that's the information that we're going to feed to the classify step. And that's the one I'm going to talk about next. The question at hand for pairwise classification is, can I calculate a model that will tell me the probability that each pair refers to the same individual? And can I find a model that does that as well as the human? Because my human reviewers over 4 years have considered hundreds of thousands of pairs of records, but we've got 50 million to consider. So we need an algorithmic solution. And again, we're not the first people to have this problem. This is an incomplete list of options, different classification models that one could choose. These are almost all entirely off the shelf in a Python module. We, in the past, used alternating decision trees. We then went through a phase where we preferred random forests. We're now moving back into considering multiple classifiers and creating a composite classifier or letting them vote. But as of right now, actually, extreme gradient boosting has been giving us tentatively the best results. But we're still trying to answer that question because, again, our question is, how do we know if we've done a good job? And this was one of the questions that we answered very poorly late last year when we thought we had a great classifier, threw a little party, moved on to the next step. What we do after classifying each pair, the model tells you the probability that that pair refers to the same individual. And you set some sort of a threshold. You say if a probability is above typically 0.5, I'm going to say that that pair is the same person. And if it's below, I'm going to say it's not the same person. And then the next thing you need to do is you need to cluster all of those pairs. So the first step is transitive closure. You say if A and B are the same and B and C is the same, then I'm going to say A and C are the same. Well, what happened late last year when I moved on to clustering was I got a black hole. It's also sometimes called a snake eating its tail. And transitive closure went, oh, all of your records are in the same cluster. All 360,000 records, that's one person. Pretty sure that's not right. And once I get through the diagnostics, I'll elaborate on how that happened. But again, it's one of those things where you get this deep into a problem and you lose sight of what it was you were asking to begin with. And so we needed to come back and say, hang on, how do we know if our classifier is doing the right thing? And so a pretty standard starting point is to look at precision and recall and an F statistic that combines those two. And again, this is where we come back to the human labeled data so that we can compare the pairs of records that the model says should match versus the pairs of records that the human says should match. So then we can have true positives. I know 6 slides ago TP meant total pairs. Now it means true positives. False positives, false negatives, true negatives. For people like me who come out of public health, this seems a lot like sensitivity or specificity or positive predictive value and negative predictive value, all the same idea. And so this is one of the first places that we want to look at how our model is doing, first in specifically the training data. So this is a subset of all the data that a human labeled. This is the data we use to train our classification model. In this case, I'm showing results from the boosted, extreme gradient boosted, but we calculate this for all of our models. And we look at a confusion matrix and we say, when did the human and the model make the same choice? And when did the human and the model make contradictory choices? And then we summarize that with our F. And in the training data, it better be good. If it's not, you're already sunk. You have to go back to square one and get more training data or calculate new features or something, because this is the data the model's already seen. It's built on it. So it is a necessary but not sufficient diagnostic. So we start here. And then we look at the same thing for held out data. You can think of this as cross-validation. You can think of this as whatever way you want to conceptualize all the other data that a human has labeled, but the model hasn't seen yet. And as expected, you're going to take a little bit of a hit. It does a little bit less good because it hasn't seen this data before. But it's still doing pretty good. Now, one of the other areas that we kind of stay up at night worrying at this step is, does my labeled data look like my unlabeled data? And what does that even mean? Is it representative in terms of the number of matches and non-matches? Is it representative in terms of the features, the way I'm comparing the pairs? Is it representative in terms of some other substantive covariate, the time and the space? This is a big question. This is a whole nother talk. But there's all this other question of how do we pick our training data and how should we subset it? And I'm happy to talk more about that if that's...
And you said that the experts cannot state, right?
And yes, the experts can say, don't know. This one was too hard to decide. So that's diagnostic tool number one. Confusion matrix, F statistic, how's the model doing compared to the matcher? Then we also want to look at calibration, which is just a slightly different way of considering essentially the same thing. What we're looking at in this graph is the score from the classification model is along the x-axis, and the proportion of the pairs of records with that score that are considered a match. So essentially, down here at the lowest end, if the model says there's an incredibly low probability that these two records refer to the same person, for that subset of pairs, we hope very few, as close to 0 as possible, were labeled as matches by the human. And out here at the high end, if the model says there's a really high probability that these refer to the same individual, then we also want our human to have said, yep, they refer to the same individual. And so this is exactly what we want to see. We want to see a nice linear relationship between the choices that the human's making and the choices that the model's making. And a way to numerically summarize that is in the Brier score. That's just the mean squared difference between the predicted probability and the true outcome, what the human labeled. So it's a way to, in a single number, kind of summarize what we're seeing in this graph. Again, all of this stuff is naturally included in all of these Python modules because everybody has these challenges. We just had to remember to go back and read the documentation and use those options. And then the last thing we think about is separation. So if we run the model on the unlabeled data, and here we're actually just learning it on a sample of 1 million because we can't wait all day, is the model certain? Is it pushing all the pairs out to a high probability of match or a low probability of match? Or is it kind of stuck in the middle at 50-50? Because 50-50 means a coin flip. 50-50 means the model is telling you exactly the same as the human. Question mark, I don't know. I don't have enough data. I can't figure it out. It's too hard. This was the graph we failed to make late last year when we thought we had a really great classifier. When we finally made this model, everything was in the middle. And I was like, oh, that's why everything got transitively closed, because my model has no idea what any of these pairs are. But this is exactly what we want to see. Our team refers to this as you're looking for a smile. And then one of our colleagues actually noticed that it's more like a kind of Joker smile, because a much larger proportion of the pairs are no's. So you want to have, and I should mention the y-axis is on the log scale, because otherwise that disproportionality just washes everything out. But this is exactly what you want to see. You want to see nice peaks on the ends and as little as possible in the middle. So this is where we are right now. We think we've got a classification model that's pretty good. These are the choices that we made in terms of which diagnostics to evaluate. We're really open to other suggestions. We'd really love to hear, other things that we've failed to consider, other things that we should be worried about. So please suggest those. And so then those are those two steps. That's blocking and classification. And the next thing that we'll get to is this clustering idea. So we'll take the scores from our pairwise classification model, we'll do transitive closure, and then we'll do hierarchical agglomerative clustering. We'll let another algorithm consider, well, transitive closure says A, B, and C all belong together, but A and C are actually far apart. So now I have to make a choice about what that cluster should actually be. And we'll break our clusters back up. And then we'll look at that data, and we'll have our human matcher review it a little bit more, and we'll iterate. We'll do some more pairs, and we'll do some more testing. And eventually, we will satisfy ourselves that we've done the best we can technically possibly do. And that will have answered this question. That will have described how many uniquely identifiable individuals were reported to one or more sources. It will enumerate what is known about this conflict. So it will answer this question. But this is the one we're really interested in. And so how do we get to that one? How do we move from an enumeration of what is known to what is missed, to what we don't know yet? And this is what statistics does for us, right? Statistics helps us to estimate what we don't know. And this, in fact, is the whole reason that our team spends so much time worrying about record linkage, is to get to a table that looks like this. Because when we organize, once we determine multiple records that refer to the same individual, we can organize that data this way, as the number of records that are unique to source A, the number of records that are unique to source B, the number of records that are in both sources, and so on and so forth through every combination of all the sources. And what we get to at the end of the table is how many observations are in none of the sources. How many observations are we missing? And once we have the data organized that way, we can apply a class of methods that we refer to as multiple systems estimation, or MSE. The methods were initially developed in ecology to count animal populations, and they're called capture, recapture. I study human rights violations, so I try not to talk about capturing humans, so I call it MSE. But it's like talking about regression. It's a very broad class of methods. Again, this is an incomplete list of possible approaches, possible references. These are really the greatest hits of the authors who have influenced our approach the most. But when you choose the appropriate method and apply it to data organized this way, what you get is an estimate of what you're missing. And this matters because we're not really interested in how many people have been killed. We're interested in, were more people killed last week than this week? Were more people in that neighborhood killed than that neighborhood? And if we don't account for what's missing, we get the answers to those questions wrong. And so this is a small example from our work in Syria. This is the number of documented deaths in a specific governorate in Hama during a 4-month period between December 2012 and January 2013. And these are our 4 documentation groups. And as we might expect, there's a little bit of disagreement between the magnitude of the documented deaths, but the pattern is in agreement. All 4 groups think that during this 4-month period, there was generally a decline in reports of violence. And when we do our record linkage and we overlay on top our integrated list of all uniquely identified individual victims from one or more sources, again, we get a slightly higher magnitude. This is to be expected. Every source knows about some victims that other sources may not. But the pattern agrees. So at this point, it would be tempting to conclude, well, the Syrian conflict is very well documented, which is true. It is incredibly well documented. So we're not really sure what the magnitude is, but we're probably getting this story right. Probably what's happening during this time period in this place is an overall decrease in violence. And then we estimate what we don't know. And the red line is the point estimate from a multiple systems estimation model. And the shading is the uncertainty, is the confidence interval. So we're uncertain. We're not really sure how bad it got. But we are very statistically certain that something very different happened in reality to what those documentation groups were able to capture. That precisely when there was a spike in violence in January 2013, all of the reports of violence were decreasing. We missed it completely. And this isn't a criticism of any of these documentation groups. We see this over and over again in our work. It is exactly when violence peaks, when the security situation dissolves, that it's no longer safe or possible to record information about that violence. Reports frequently decrease exactly when actual acts of violence increase. And this matters not just so that we describe what's happening correctly, not just so that we do justice to those victims' stories, but because someday this may be a question about accountability. We know that in January 2013 in Hama, there was active fighting between opposition groups and state forces, and that territorial control of that area was changing hands rapidly. And so someday, perhaps, someone will ask, when this group gained control of this area, did violence increase or decrease? And if we answer that question based on what we're able to observe, we get that answer wrong. The only way to get that answer right is to estimate what we don't know. If we have any hope of holding perpetrators accountable, of achieving any level of justice and historical clarity, we have to estimate what we don't know. If we cannot name every victim, the very least we can do is count them. I'll leave it there. I'm happy to take questions.
We have plenty of time for questions.
Do you qualify the relative reliability of the sources?
That is a great question. The short answer is no. We rely upon what each of the individual sources describe as their own verification methods, and we take that at face value. We also rely upon our own summary descriptive statistics. Whenever we do get a source where it just looks really different from any of the other sources, then we kind of raise an eyebrow, and we haven't had that experience yet. But the other way that we handle it is in a very statistical way, which is we run sensitivity analyses on our findings. And so for something like that example in Hama, we ask ourselves, well, how many of the records would have to be wrong in some way, false or incorrect, for us to draw a different conclusion in this analysis? And so we'll let 10% of the records flip location or date or just drop them. And we'll move through increasing proportions of dropping records and do that sensitivity analysis. And so far also for findings like that, you have to assume that 50% or more of the records are wrong in some way before the conclusion changes. But that's a very statistical way to handle that uncertainty, because we do just take at face value the veracity of the group's documentation. Yeah.
Besides using off-the-shelf machine learning libraries, is your group involved with hand designing and hand implementing advanced machine learning methods?
We are not. We really don't have that kind of capacity right now. We occasionally do a little bit of hand implementation of statistical models. Our colleague Christian has written in our package implementing decomposable graphical models, but that was kind of a one-off. That was a little bit of an anomaly, so generally no. I saw another, yeah.
In your last slide, you show a peak in January 2013 that is present in your conclusion and not present in the raw data that you took in.
Yes.
I understand exactly what you were explaining about how that happens. I don't understand, however, how you got that out of the data that you have.
Yeah, that's a great question. So, Hama is on the left-hand side. And specifically, the difference that we observed in Hama in that time period was the amount of records that were reported by pairs of sources as compared to single and all four sources. So what this graph is showing, oh, my computer's telling me I've been looking at it for too long. So what this graph is showing is the number of records that were reported to only one source, to two sources, to three sources, to all four sources, and then the darkest shading at the top is the estimate of the ones we think we're missing. And so what we see in that specific month in Hama is that overlap pattern changes.
And so how do you validate this algorithm? That in fact by doing this counting, which sounds plausible, but how do you go back to ground truth and verify that your inference from that discrepancy is correct?
Well, in this case, there's not a whole lot we can do. Theoretically, the multiple systems estimation methods have been verified in a variety of applications, but then specifically, there's one project we worked on in Kosovo where we implemented a slightly different model, but the same idea, in the early 2000s to estimate how many people had been killed specifically during the Kosovo bombing the NATO bombing campaign in 1999. And we calculated those estimates in the early 2000s, and this past year, the Human Rights Center, based out of Bosnia, has completed an exhaustive enumeration of all the victims that has ultimately confirmed those estimates. But those opportunities are pretty scarce. Occasionally, also in Kosovo, there was, in between those two projects, there was a survey, a more conventional retrospective mortality survey that also confirmed the results. So occasionally, we do get the opportunity for confirmation via surveys.
I was wondering if, like you were saying, is there a way to get better priors by including how you did in past conflicts?
Oh, that's a good question. We've pondered, we're like everybody, right? We're moving toward being Bayesian. We're not quite there yet. And we've pondered trying to include priors that indicate the question of how much confidence we have in the sources, which makes us anxious because that's so subjective. We haven't really thought about past conflicts.
So like how were the deaths in Kosovo that were reported at the time compared to what the survey showed? Especially if you can get dates for when these people actually died. So
right.
Like maybe you can get a better estimate of.
Yeah, that's a really great idea. And even just something sort of simple like just the proportion of documented versus undocumented that we've seen in previous conflicts would make a great prior. Yeah, thanks. That's a really good idea. Yeah.
I didn't quite understand the graph you're talking about, it's ideal separation in smile shape. What was that a graph of?
Oh, sure. Sorry, I can go back to it. Right, because we did change our units and everything. So the x-axis is now 100 times the score from the classification model. So it's the number of unlabeled pairs that have each of those scores in the classification model. So is the classification model assigning most of the pairs a relatively high or a relatively low score, or is it kind of letting them all sit in the middle, saying that it doesn't know what the answer is? Sure.
In the graph right before this, I'm wondering why you think it should be linear. It seems like it'd be great if it was a sigmoid or something sharper.
I love that question.
More features.
Because we totally thought it should be a sigmoid too. And we spent a really long time kind of being like, oh, we have an S-curve, we're done, it's great. And I honestly don't have a very good mathematical answer for why that's not the right shape. I only have our empirical experience that when you let it sort of sit a little too much, when you let it flatten out there at the uncertainty point, that you get worse results on the other diagnostics, and you get worse results when you then compare to future hand matching. But yes, your intuition is right on, and I share it, and I don't have a very satisfying answer.
So a lot of things on the next plot that were all the way on the left have sort of been smoothed out, I guess, by the model then a little bit, right?
Yeah, well, and from the, yeah, for sure.
Yeah, you listed a bunch of different MSE methods. I'm just wondering which did you try and which did you end up using?
Sure. We used log linear models forever because, as Patrick likes to say, we really like to be cutting edge from the 1990s. So these preliminary results that I showed actually are from log linear modeling approaches. And then what we're moving toward now is decomposable graphical models. This DGA package that our colleague wrote, we're much happier with. Not only those results, but also we get much more intuitive uncertainties. I mean, that's why we're all becoming Bayesian, right? Because then you get a confidence interval that actually means what you want it to mean. So those are the ones we tend to use.
Okay, so we have time for one last question. I was wondering, back to the labeling and the expert doesn't know. In order to balance your training set versus your data set, you could have that as a third label. Have you tried that? So the labels would be yes, matching, not matching, I don't know. And then your model will match to that.
Oh, that's
And
true.
then you can make a decision post-mortem to that. But at least in that way you can evaluate your model exactly.
Yeah.
Because your training set will only have yes or no, but it's missing the middle.
Yeah.
Where your model predicts all the way to the middle.
Yeah, that's a really good point, actually, because we've been doing that in sort of an ad hoc way where we sample from the middle of the model and then ask the reviewer to look at it again. But you're right, we have those labels, we should just keep them. Yeah.
All right, that note.
Thanks, everybody.